let's go. You lead the way. Where are we headed? Towards a net zero future, of course. Cleaner water, more electricity, a sustainable society. That's the destination we've set ourselves. This we know. Yes, we know exactly where we're going, but we need to get there quicker. So, let's build on the progress we've already made by working and walking together. With the right partners, tools, and ideas, we'll become an unstoppable force. This we know. Right now, there are businesses who are putting technology and sustainability at the heart of everything they do. Brave leaders turning maybes into realities and building something better for everyone. Now is the time to look to the future and reinvent ourselves today, empowering others to do the same tomorrow. Yes, we know what the future holds, and we know how to get there. So, let's take charge of the journey today.
Hello, I'm Melissa Stark, and I look after renewables and energy transition services for Accenture. Today, I want to welcome you to our session, Coal to Renewables. Accenture completed a study on Indonesia to maximize the system value for their energy transition, and the move from coal to renewables was one of the key focus areas of that study, and that's the focus of the session today. Today we're going to share real-life case studies on how to do it, and the biggest challenge, how to finance it. So we know that the investment required will need to go from about $150 billion to over $1 trillion by 2030, and that's going to be one of the key topics of conversation. I had the pleasure of spending a lot of Monday with the Indonesia delegation here at COP26, and there were three things that stood out for me in terms of them really embracing the energy transition and taking charge of it locally. The first is the launch of the Impact Investment Fund. That was the first private fund that's locally owned to invest in early stage SDG type investments. So that's a fantastic show of commitment locally to that kind of transition. The second, and all of you will have heard of, and we will hear more about today, is the launch of the Energy Transition Mechanism that looks at retiring coal as well as growing renewables. And then finally, and the thing that actually stood out for us the most as we were doing the Indonesia System Value Analysis is the new RUPTL that just came out about a month ago. In that new RUPTL, we will see more renewables, renewables being about 51% of the new capacity. One of the reasons that we had asked Anindya Bakri to open this session was because he is the largest coal producer. Unfortunately, he became ill this morning and he had to cancel at the very last minute, but he sent me this quote that I want to share with all of you. So I'd asked him, I want something that shows, largest coal producer still supporting the transition. And this is what his comment was. As one of Indonesia's largest coal producers, I'm aware that our 79 years old Bakri Group's energy and industrials footprint have relied heavily on fossil fuels. I believe businesses need to move hand in hand with government to transition. I'm leading the group to pivot to renewables, especially investing in solar in the main islands as well as the remote parts of the archipelago. This is timely as Indonesia announced its ambition to reach net zero 2060 or earlier, supported by the great roadmap of the new RUPTL that marks a fresh change in the directions of travel. Myself, along with the leadership of the Indonesia Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Kadin, truly welcomes these and that Indonesia shows up strong at COP26 in Glasgow. Anindya Bakri, CEO of Bakri Brothers and chairman of Kadin. So I think that statement shows the vision and the commitment of the energy transition. We are fortunate to have Fabi Tumiwa, the director of IESR and chairman of Indonesia Solar Association, with us now to actually give us some of that local perspective and that local Indonesia vision. Fabi, welcome.
Thank you, Melissa.
Okay, so let us kick off in the interview. There were a lot of announcements this week from India, Indonesia, a lot of the coal producers. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a good start that we have seen that countries are moving to set net zero target. And yesterday in the on the Global to Clean statement, also we've seen that 47 countries and a number of subnational and organizations support this statement. I think it's a good start. There's still more we should do in order to meet Paris Agreement goals to 1.5 degree. But I think looking at the enthusiasm and spirit, we can hope that this target will improve. But more important is actually actions rather than just statement.
Right. And I mean, and Anand mentioned net zero by 2060.
Yeah.
So do you have some?
Initially, even if you look at the initial plan that was 2070, and is a good start for Indonesia. 2060 earlier. Well, we are fossil fuel dependent countries.
Yeah.
And if you look at the power sector, more than 86% of our electricity come from fossil fuel.
Right.
So transforming that into renewable is not easy task.
No.
So the government tried to be realistic, but we also seen that the government open to more ambitious action. So they put sooner, because sooner means that we can do more if we get support from international developed countries and international communities.
Absolutely. And I think some folks ask, and one of the questions in one of the Indonesia sessions on Monday was, is there a roadmap or how do we get there? The RUPTL actually tries to be that kind of a roadmap. So in the latest RUPTL, more than 50% of the new installed generation is renewables, a lot of it solar. What do you think of that? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the whole energy transition roadmap is still being developed, again, because we just had a few months once the decisions for net zero emission came in May this year. So the overall roadmap up to 2060 is being developed now. But RUPTL that is formulated after that announcement actually tried to capture that spirit.
Right.
So we have seen that for the first time, actually, for the next 10 years, renewables are more dominant than fossil fuels. So this is good. And if you look at the action for Paris Agreement perspective, this 10 years is very, very important step to reach net zero emissions. So it is good, and I think we have seen that our utility PLN also has stated that they are moving toward this directions, and also we see that there is a lot of support from private sectors that also think that they have to transform their business anyway, align with this new trend.
In the Accenture system value analysis, there were two things on the coal to renewables transition that we had proposed, and actually I did present on Monday to the Indonesia delegation. So one was there are still about 5 gigawatts of coal going to be built between 2024 to 2028. So this is coal where construction has not started, right? It's not started. I think the stuff that's under construction, okay, that's very difficult, right? If it's like half built. We had proposed maybe instead of building that coal, those coal, you would replace it with solar or renewable energy zones. Do you have some thoughts on that? And then I'll tell you the second thing, and then I can ask you.
Yeah, I think, yes, those plan is, coal plan is part of this 35 gigawatt, which already contracted, but delay in constructions, right? Because of this COVID and other things. But we have to see whether, also because the announcement made by a number of countries no longer support financing for overseas coal, and some of these coal projects are actually financed by Japan, Korea, and China. So we will see what will happen in the next few years whether they can get financial close or not. But since it's already in the pipeline, PLN has to put that in their RUPTL. But I think they 2 years from now, we can see different RUPTL with more renewables.
Okay.
But again, depends on whether
gets financing.
Get financing.
Exactly, exactly. And I think one of the things that we're proposing in the system value analysis is actually to replace that coal with like renewable energy zones, and then that way it's still kind of an investable asset. It's still fairly a big asset. So I think that was one. And then the second point was that there's about 7 gigawatts of coal that is set to be retired by 2035. And one of the things that we proposed is, could you retire it by 2030 and then reuse that coal infrastructure, like the transmission lines, the civils, et cetera, for solar? So do you have some thoughts on using some of that infrastructure for solar?
Yeah, it's very interesting because yesterday, I think during the fire dialogue in Indonesia Pavilion, our energy minister actually made statement that the government undertake exercise to phase out 5.5 gigawatt of a coal, unabated coal, before 2030, and another 3.7 gigawatt to be replaced by renewable. So they're doing this exercise, but again, the minister state that we can do that if we get financing, and it's around $48 billion is required to retire and replace that coal plant with renewable. So it is actually aligned, and also yesterday with this statement that the government see that to phase out coal in the 2040s, before 2050. So it's advanced that what being said earlier and what the plan with the RUPTL actually.
Right, and plant by plant. Right,
yeah.
Plant by plant. Because I think one of the things to highlight, too, in terms of the energy transition mechanism, is that there is a list of coal plants to be retired. So they have prepared that list.
Yeah.
And so it is about just making that, there is a lot of detail behind the announcement, and it's about going plant by plant and trying to see if you can retire that. So, so aside from financing, what are some other enablers that you think in terms for a successful transition from coal to renewables over the next 10 years as like the main decade, aside from international financing?
Well, at the end, you have to replace the capacities, because if you look at Indonesia current energy consumption, electricity consumption, we are still lower. I mean, they average around 1,300 kilowatt per capita. If you look our neighbor country, Indonesia is still low. So it means that our electricity demand can grow much faster as the economic growth.
Right.
It means that we need more capacities. Yeah? And when we stop building coal and we have to build renewable, it means what we require investment.
Right.
And also to transform the entire energy system to meet the net zero emission target is even higher.
Right.
Our analysis shows that from 2020 to 2030, at least we need between 25 to 30 billion annually to transform the entire energy sectors toward net zero by 2050. Even from 2030 to 2060, the number is higher, between 45 to $60 billion annually. So that size of investment is needed. And to attract this kind of investment, of course, is very important in terms of regulatory and policy consistency, transparency in auctioning, in bidding process, and upgrade the entire infrastructures to make renewable can penetrate in the higher level.
Right, and you along with IESR, along with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, published a fantastic study for those of you who have not looked at it on solar in Indonesia, like building on this point. Can you just tell us a little bit more about like some of the highlights of the study, like drilling down a little bit on the infrastructure type required and the policies that would support attracting the investment?
Well, yes, that study we released a couple of months ago, and I think it shows that solar can support Indonesia to meet this renewable energy target. We have now our national renewable energy target, 23% by 2025, and we see that solar can help to achieve that target because solar is scalable, it can build faster, so we calculated around 18 gigawatt it's needed with the investment around $15 billion. So some of the barriers on to scale up this solar is, of course, some issue with the regulations. The local content regulation, which seen as problematic right now, and the government enforced that. Also, the lack of clarity in the past with the PLN, with the procurement mechanism, I think is one of the key issues that need to be resolved, and the entire power purchase agreement type that could make a project bankable or not. So that's some issue that some policy and recommendation that we highlight to be reformed to attract this level of investment.
And could you talk a little about the infrastructure? So solar is configurable. So, utility scale, transmission, or distributed microgrids in the island, could be a mixture, right? Given the thousands of islands in Indonesia, you have kind of opportunities for very distributed solar in some of the islands, and then some really utility scale big connections that could connect some islands to each other. Can you tell us a little bit about the government policies that would be needed to support some of the infrastructure pieces?
Yeah, one of the government policies in terms of utilizing fast renewable energy resource in Indonesia is to build interconnections, island interconnections. So we supposed to connect Java and Sumatra, and later on Java and Kalimantan, where some of these renewables resources are abundant. So that's already in the plan, I think. Also, I think modernizing the transmission and distribution network, allow more energy storage because solar and wind is intermittent. So allow this energy storage to be built, integrated with the like smart grid to allow distributed renewable energy resources to be connected with the main grid and supply the electricity constantly in the reliable and affordable way.
And I guess maybe and I think that's right. I think that it's a whole scale, and what we're trying to go through. What I want to share in this interview is that it's like a full system transition that's required. And so my last question is about the workforce and the people, and have it being an equitable, inclusive transition, given the number of people that work in coal now, that obviously need still a future job, and the fact that your growth. I think maybe what people don't realize, a lot of people don't realize, is the per capita CO2 emissions of Indonesia is very small compared to any developed market. And the reason per capita emissions are very small in developing and emerging markets is because they are growing. And so the idea is eventually those per capita emissions would grow to be Europe's equivalent, but they are well below that now. So we have to do these transitions in a way that allow for that growth, support that growth, and still support the workforce. So could you comment a little bit on that and how we can pivot from coal to solar and bring everybody with us?
Yes, I think that's true. Although if you look at the number, actually employed at the coal sector is not as much as the other countries. I think around less than 200,000 people. But if you look at the entire coal business, mining and everything is beyond bigger than that. Well, it is challenge to really transform the workforce from coal to renewables. I think there is a number of study and analysis because if you look at the coal production is concentrated in the 4 provinces in Indonesia that produce around 85% of coal, and also the type of job is very different. But our study showed that actually from reaching net zero emission by 2050 can create additional 3.6 million. And is more than potential job losses around 1.2 million people. So again, this net zero net zero target could create more jobs, but then it requires additional support for reskilling, retraining, and directing that workforce through to the to the real project, so they can get experience and so on. But we need more people actually in these sectors. For instance, just as simple, we need more solar installers, right? That in Indonesia is fast market. Rooftop solar is one of that. And if every gigawatt of solar rooftop, you can create around 20,000 jobs.
Right.
So you need installer, you need PV designers, and I think that we need retraining on this.
And I think just to make sure everybody heard that, over 2 million more jobs with solar than with coal. That's the net of the creation. And I think we are seeing that, right? We see that in India as well, the number of jobs being created in India. And in the US, top 3 jobs that do not require a college degree growing by 2030, solar is in those jobs. So is wind, by the way, but solar is one of the top 3 that don't require a college education, which is fantastic, but obviously requires skills and training.
Yeah, so that's actually met with the Indonesia workforce qualifications also.
It's fantastic. It is a fantastic opportunity. We just have to think about it really holistically. And you will hear later from Louise, who will talk about the system value framework, which gives us a framework to do that. So with that, can we thank Fabi for the interview and giving us a fantastic context on Indonesia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now bring John Moore to the floor and the next set of panelists who are going to talk about ideas on how to do it. So John, do you want to come up? And actually, I think all the panelists come up, and then John will introduce you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Fabi. And we're going to run 2 panels this morning. The second panel is all around financing, i.e. how do we fund and pay for the transition from coal to renewables. The first panel is actually about what are we going to do? How do we actually do it practically? How do we deliver on that? And we have virtually Salvatore Bernabei, who's CEO of Enel Green Power. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world.
Good morning.
Morning. Great to see you. We have Dr. Aranaba Ghosh, who's the CEO of the CEEW. So that's the Council for Energy, Environment and Water, which is looking at the emerging markets and the transition there. And then Louise Anderson, who's the Electricity Industry Manager at WEF. So we're going to talk about some of the lessons learned from this coal to renewables transition from around the world. And I'm going to start with you, Louise. So you work with Accenture on this system value framework, a report looking at Indonesia and the transition. Can you say a little bit about the framework itself? So, what's the idea behind it and what does it include, and some of the key recommendations?
Absolutely, thank you. So I should probably start by saying Accenture and I worked very closely, but actually the real content came from the electricity industry from around the world. And our ability to consult with companies, electricity utility and energy technology companies from around the world that are part of the World Economic Forum's network. But where the idea came from was back in 2020 when we first started feeling the effects of COVID in the forum, we were asked, each industry, so we have maybe 18 different industries, and the industries were asked to take a look and try and see if there's a short duration project that we could take part in which would help our industry accelerate out of the COVID pandemic once we got there. And what we did was we brought the idea to the CEOs from the industry, including Claudio Faxin, who's from Hitachi Energy, who's going to join us in a few minutes. And the CEOs came together and had a really interesting conversation about, okay, what could we do? And what they thought is, all right, we need to think about how do we accelerate economic growth while at the same time accelerating energy transition, and how do we do that in a short time frame, so 3 to 5 years. And what we came up with was this idea about system value. And why system value? Because we felt that when we make, as a society, when we make policy or business decisions relating to energy transition, we have a tendency to focus on cost. Whereas cost is a really important component, but we also need to think about value. And when I talk about value, I'm thinking about value to society, to the environment, as well as to the energy system and to the economy. And so, again, Accenture and ourselves and this large group of electricity industry companies from around the world got together and said, okay, we can create a framework to help policymakers or enable policymakers and business leaders when they take these decisions to really have that framework around the decision that they try to make. So what you see on the screen here are each tile represents an outcome, which is linked to a societal or an environmental or an economic or an energy-related benefit that we're looking to kind of push forward in any policy or investment decision. And what we found about the framework was that it could be flexible. So every market is different. Every market would not need necessarily to apply each of those outcomes. But each market would be able to choose, okay, here are the 6 priority outcomes for me when I look at, for example, accelerating energy transition, COVID recovery in a 3 to 5 year period. Now, what we did then, we have a framework, okay, it's great, and we were very happy with it, and we saw, resilience and security, we saw flexibility, we saw FDI, we saw jobs, and we thought we were great. But we needed to prove it, right? We needed to say, okay, this actually works. And so we worked with the electricity companies around the world, and indeed some energy companies as well, to apply it to 5 different markets. And we got results from the 5 different markets, which really highlighted, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but which really highlighted that actually there were some no-regret investments that you could make, which were efficiency, renewables deployment, and grids.
And can I just ask, was this looking at what had been done? So you're looking at what had been done or what could be done?
What could be done. So our objective function was this piece of, okay, what are those solutions that exist that will really accelerate the economic recovery while accelerating energy transition in a 3 to 5 year period. And when we were looking at that objective function, what we were finding was efficiency, renewables, and grids. They're where we need to be focusing. Now, to kind of finalize that, we were really happy then to see, once we released it, that a number of governments took up the framework and started applying it to some of their own challenges. So they changed the objective function slightly, but they were finding very similar results in terms of efficiency, grids, and renewables. So, for example, Ukraine's government applied it to their economic planning. We also saw the utilities from Ireland applying it to some of their climate commitments and how to reach their climate commitments. And then Accenture also applied it to Indonesia, and we talked about that Melissa talked about that a little bit earlier on the outcomes for Indonesia. And maybe to link it back then to the coal to renewables topic that we're talking about, some of those results that we were finding, and if I talk about India very quickly, we saw that there was a big opportunity to accelerate retirement of coal plants in India by replacing them with, for example, solar in the solar parks that India has started to build. And that was a really nice opportunity because that brought in, an existing solar park where you could replace your coal plant, so your brownfield site, with a solar park, and you've already got the transmission connection, meaning you don't have to worry about the land permits, which isn't an issue in India. Now, there are a number of other findings in markets, but maybe we can come back to them later.
We'll touch on some of the specifics depending on the time we have. And Arunabha, we were just mentioning India there, and you've been looking at coal retirements, how to prioritize coal retirements in India. What are some of the key findings? What are the key lessons from that?
Well, first of all, many thanks to Accenture for having me here. When we think of the energy transition, it should not be a binary that, you have coal today and solar tomorrow. We already have built out in India more than 100,000 megawatts of solar and wind and biomass and small hydro capacity. This is for an electricity system that's 388,000 megawatts. But the new targets that the Prime Minister has announced this week take us to 500,000 megawatts within the course of this decade. So basically, India is looking to build more renewables than our entire electricity system today. At the same time, while that system still needs to come on stream, the latent energy demand from a population that has very low consumption of electricity needs to be met. So at least during the course of this decade, coal will still remain a dominant feature of the Indian electricity system. So then the question arises for us, how do we meet people's energy aspirations while making sure that every new electron is cleaner than the previous one? So that's where this phased approach towards coal phase out comes in. So what we did at CEEW, is look at plant by plant, about 194 gigawatts, nearly the entire thermal power fleet that we have in India, and see where are we getting power from the most efficient plants. And unfortunately, currently we are not, because the state-run utilities are locked into power purchase agreements that buy power from some of the most old or inefficient plants. Now, just using age as a number doesn't work. So you've got to use multiple parameters, station heat rates, the kind of coal being used, and so forth. If you do that, our estimation at CW is that India can shut down or mothball between 30 and 50 gigawatts of coal-based power pretty much immediately without impacting electricity production or the stability of the grid, because you would switch that to the newer efficient power plants. What would that do? What would be the benefit? Number one, you would save on the coal consumption itself in these inefficient power plants, which would amount to about one.
Sorry, that's switching from inefficient coal
from
to more
inefficient coal to efficient coal,
yep.
And shutting down that 30 to 50 gigawatts,
yep.
would save about $1.2 billion a year for the utilities, because they are paying for less coal that has been burnt. Number two, the way our tariffs are structured, you pay a fixed price for the asset, and then you pay the variable price for the coal that's burnt. So over the course of the next 5 years or so, these plants can avoid another $1 billion or $1.1 billion in that payment of those fixed costs. On top of that, you have another $5 billion of savings over the lifetime of those plants. What is it going to cost to shut down the plants? We estimate that it's going to be somewhere in the order of about $3 billion for the debt and equity write-down, and about another $1.5 billion to pay for the compensation of the workers. So effectively, I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, but effectively what this means is we're doing three things. Number one, we are shifting immediately to, or we could shift immediately to more efficient assets. Number two, and therefore the PLFs of those efficient assets increases. Number two, we save distribution companies, which are already financially stressed, money immediately for coal that does not need to be burnt. And number three, we have a write-down plan that actually pays off for itself within about 5 to 7 years. The numbers add up. Now, will the politics line up?
And can I ask, how is that coordinated with the build-out of, renewables? How is that coordinated?
Indeed. I mean, what we are suggesting is that India, from an electricity governance perspective, should have something like a National Electricity Council, which helps the central and the state governments coordinate. Because what's happening, John, is the central government sets out long-term targets, but it's the state governments or their utilities that are going to buy this renewable. So a state like Rajasthan, which has a lot of solar potential in the West, might say, well, I don't need any more solar power unless some other state wants to buy it from me. So you need some coordination. But the rollout of renewables has to go really rapidly. Every working hour, we have to deploy 10.5 megawatts of renewables for the next 9 years. So while we talk here, 5 megawatts should have been deployed. So that requires the use of the solar parks. That requires land clearances in advance. That requires the grid to be ready in advance to absorb this additional capacity that's coming in. While you're making sure that the grid also remains stable, because you're moving towards the efficient power system. So I don't think it's a coal versus renewables. I think it's a three-part problem. It's renewables plus efficient coal versus inefficient coal.
Right, but a lot of coordination of that, so that council would coordinate that sort of...
That's our recommendation, yes.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Well, we'll come back in a minute to sort of how to accelerate the build-out of renewables. Salvatore, just a quick question. Enel have actually spent a lot of time closing plants and have plans in this decade to close a lot more. How's that gone? What have you learned that you think could be applicable to nations that are still building more plants and still growing? What would your recommendations be?
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me?
Thank you.
Okay. So as Enel, we took the decision in 2015 to close our coal plants. And it took a couple of years to start the process in 2017. Our current plan is to end this process of coal phase out in 2027. I'm mentioning these dates because the message here that has already been mentioned before, the transition takes a time. You cannot do it from one year to the other. But first of all, you have to have a clarity. You have to have a clear vision that you want to go on a certain direction. And what we are doing is closing our plants and at the meantime replacing them with renewables. Just to give you a figure, we had 17 gigawatt of coal plants in 2017, and we will go to zero in 10 years. We will increase our renewable capacity by 100 gigawatt in the next decade. So the consequence of this will be that we will go from our 400 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hours that we had 4 years ago at the start of this process to 82 at the end of the decade. So we will smash down the CO2 emission. This is an action that really aims at reducing the CO2 emission. So we are not speaking about rare or strange process of offsetting. We are changing the way we work. Because if you consider that at the beginning of the process, 30% of our generation came from coal, today we are just 7%, and we will go to zero in 6 years more. It means that whatever company who used to sell a certain product accounting for 30% of their revenues will replace this with something new. Is really a disruption of the sector. So what we are doing in this moment is that we are going through a process of really disruption of our business. We had the courage to take this decision 6 years ago, so clarity about the direction, and now we are executing. In this moment, we have already closed 7 gigawatt capacity, and we will close the 9 more in the next years. Now, there is the issue to say, okay, what are the consequences of this action? First of all, the consequence for Enel, because, I mean, we have to survive, between brackets, to this process, but then there could be consequences about the society, about the economics, about the environment. Before it has been mentioned that the important concept here is not the cost, is the value. And in fact, we have to understand what is the value here that has to be considered. As Enel, we apply the concept of CSV, creating shared value. So whatever actions we are taking is aimed at maximizing the value for Enel and for the territory where we are operating. So just to give you some figures, we are not just saying we have to close the plant and full stop. First of all, we have to take an agreement with the system operators, because in some cases, they are also denying us the closure of these plants, although we would like to close them. Unfortunately, it's just a small stake of it. We are closing 43 plants worldwide. I refer to Italy, Spain, Chile, and Colombia. These are the countries where we had or we still have some coal plants. And in some very specific cases, less than 5%, we have been told unless you replace this coal with a gas plant, new highly efficient gas plant on these particular nodes of the grids, the systems could not afford or could not allow the closure, the coal phase out of the plant. But I insist, this is just the strictly necessary according to the system operator. The new reality of these plants would be something that we used to call the poles of the generation of the future for the future generations. So we are saying, look, territory, we want to repurpose entirely these sites, these 43 sites. So we envisage a future where instead of coal, we will have a PV plus system of storage, whatever kind of storage, battery energy storage, chemicals, but also gravitational, thermal storage, green hydrogen. In some cases, as said before, some highly efficient gas, but also, apart from these new kinds of generations, we are also taking into consideration the needs of the territory. This is what CSV means, understanding the needs of the territory. And we are proposing some of this area for other activities that are of interest of the territory. For instance, we will make possible to install physically on the sites some agricultural entrepreneurship activities like the hydroponic greenhouses. Or in some other cases, we will install or we will build a facility for logistics. So custom duty warehouses. In some other cases, we will give this territory for the sites for the territory to install or to build research centers. Or in some other cases, we also facilitate the installation of activities of circular economy. Just a couple of examples. I mentioned that we want also to install gravitational storage, where we used to produce electricity by burning coal. So the gravitational storage means that you have some weights that you are lifting, and then when you need the energy, these big weights are coming down, okay? So what should be the materials that form this weight? We are putting in activity a circular project where the materials will come from the blades of the wind farms that are reaching the end of useful life. We'll collect these blades, we will then treat these blades, and we will obtain the components, the material, the raw materials to form these blocks, these weights that will be used in the storage, gravitational storage system. So at the end, the process could be done in different way. If you do it properly, in my opinion, by involving the local territory, by understanding that you need also an outcome in terms of creation of new jobs, social and economical benefit for the territory, if you put in place circular economy, at the end is a win-win for the company and for the society. So if I can make a suggestion for, please.
Quick question. So this it sounds like a great strategy, but what's the toughest thing you found? So you know, it's going to create more jobs and, you know, sort of a better industry. What's the toughest piece to get people to agree to this shared value concept?
Look, to be honest, here the toughest issue is the permits, although it could be incredible. But I mean, we have showed, we have studied, and then we are demonstrating that by doing this, you create 3 more jobs respect to investing the same €1 million in building new coal plants, for instance. So there is an obvious benefit for the society, but the issue is then, I mean, it's difficult for people to understand that this solution could create a benefit unless they see, they touch, that is a real benefit. So we have to work in making it happen as soon as we can. And in order to do that, it's not a problem of money for doing the investment. It's not a problem of technology. It's not a problem of business model. We have this circular economy business model. The issue is getting the permits to make it happen, to convince the local population that this is really something interesting for them, and so to converge all the efforts to have the permits at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you for that. And I'm just going to turn to Arunabe now in terms of, so scaling up. Salvatore talks about the difficulties actually in permitting. So yeah, what are the real challenges? And India has made some great progress on this as a good example. But what are the real challenges for moving fast on renewables to build out the alternatives to coal?
No, I mean, land, of course, is the challenge. And that's why we've seen that where India has managed to set up these large solar parks in a sort of plug-and-play model, that has been the most attractive for international investors, because they then don't want to work through the sort of messiness of navigating the local political economy and getting the permitting done on their own, etc. So we see that the bulk, more than 80% of the international investment in renewables has gone into the solar parks model. Now, can that be scaled up? In part, yes, but that also means the pace at which we need to do this, the state governments will have to start planning for 2023 or 2024 now and make sure that those land parcels are secured and start talking to the grid companies, etc., and making sure that the evacuation infrastructure is already ready. But just one more thing that I would say, just building on what we heard right now, we got to also look at the opportunity in distributed energy, not because it's off the grid, it's a more distributed infrastructure, because then you are looking at the huge opportunity that exists on rooftop. The 40,000 megawatt target that we have for rooftop generation, we've only met about 6,000 megawatts of that. The huge opportunity in distributed solar-based irrigation pumps. India wants to deploy about 2.7 million of them. It already has more solar irrigation pumps than any other country in the world. But putting them and then connecting them to the grid becomes another source of distributed generation. Then we can add the green hydrogen mission, which the Prime Minister announced just 2 months ago. India has the objective of about 10 gigawatts of green hydrogen production capacity. But what that does is it also, within the decade, but again what that does is creates another opportunity to start deploying renewables for a very different kind of off-taker in the electrolyzer business. And then you have the electric mobility charging opportunity. So once we start thinking about accelerating renewable energy capacity deployment, we have to also think about all the alternative ways in which that can happen rather than just large-scale plants coming up.
Great. So we've talked about renewables, we've talked about the grids, and actually, Louise, at the beginning you said there was renewables, grids, and energy efficiency. Do you want to say a little bit more about energy efficiency and how that fits in, and some sort of practical examples?
Sure. So maybe, again, stepping back, we're all looking at net zero at the moment. So what is this net zero integrated energy system of the future going to look like, really? Probably 50 to 80% electrification. And if you look at our system today, according to Lawrence Berkeley Labs in the US, actually we're wasting about 70% of the energy input into our system. It's not being used. It goes away through the process of converting fossil fuels into that final usable energy. And in a grid or in an energy system where you're looking at 50 to 80% electrification, a lot of that wasted energy disappears. And that's the efficiency piece. And that's a really big efficiency play. And that's where we should be aiming for. But what I will say, and I want to go back to the renewables and the grids piece, renewables have to play a huge role in that 60 to 80 or 50 to 80%. And it has to be clean electrification. And that's the piece why we need to get away from coal, or we need to get away from the fossil fuel generation in our electricity system. But what we're seeing, and I think what you've touched on as well a few minutes ago, is without grids to support that, without grids to be able to integrate the renewables, we're not going to be able to get there. So yes, efficiency is super important, but I think when we talk about efficiency, we also need to be talking about the renewables and the grids in order to accelerate that path to a future energy system which is majority based on electrification.
Right, so energy efficiency sort of sits on top of that, the renewables and grid rollout. So thank you. We actually have 2.5, 3 minutes left. So it's just going to ask one final question. Maybe Salvatore, for you first. If you were Indonesia right now thinking about this transition from coal to renewables, what would be the one thing that you would focus on the most?
Look, as said before, Indonesia is a country that is relying on coal, and they have also availability of coal. So I understand that the easiest way for them is to try to continue to invest some way on this coal, although you could call it a clean coal, something like that. As Enel also 15 years ago, we put into operation the last power plant in Italy, and it was the best technology available in terms of coal. So it's a coal that polluted less than other sources of coal. So I understand that Indonesia, like some other countries, are in the same situation that some other countries like Italy were in which they were 15 years ago. So they have to have the courage to understand that is feasible, a higher and faster transition. But in order to do that, something in the transition could hurt some pieces of the society. So it's really important to assess properly this transition. When it comes to the jobs that could be lost, for instance, and a lot of people say, I'm working on a coal mine, I'm working in a coal plant, what would happen to my job? This is something that could be probably addressed. Just to give you a figure, because I'm telling this because we lived this experience in the past. So half of the workers within our plants have been reskilled and requalified. It is a principle that has been reminded before. So today they are working on renewables. We spoke with all of our suppliers. We performed like the road show by meeting all of our suppliers worldwide, and we told them, look, the transition is not just about renewables, it's also about e-mobility, as has been reminded before. So, as Enel, we will install chargers for cars, we will install renewables, distributed high scale, utility scale, so there is a plenty of job for you in the future. And I'm available also to train you, to support you in this transition. So whatever country now is facing to the future and could be scared about the impact of the transition, my recommendation for Indonesia and for others is that if you work understanding the impacts on the territory, working together in an ecosystem approach, so understanding the consequences on the jobs, understanding the consequences on the grids, because it's true, we cannot just speak about renewables. We have to speak about making more renewables, anticipating or not investing more in coal, investing in grids, but also investing in energy efficiency. Because at the end, we will never reach the Paris goal agreement if we only store renewables. We have also to invest in energy efficiency. We have to decrease the consumption, because this is the fastest way to reach the targets. But it means also changing our lifestyles, our way to live. So to the Indonesia, I will tell to the people, look, there is a more sustainable way to live also in the future that is not more expensive, although it is a prejudice that could be in the society. Because when it comes to electrical cars, it is not more expensive than a diesel car. When it comes to what will be my job for the future, it's not true that the future jobs will be less than the current one or that will be less paid. We are experiencing this day after day. So I think that with the proper planning, and especially with involving the different stakeholders, the industry, the financing institution, the people, and everyone here, a better, more sustainable future, a brighter future could be designed also for countries like Indonesia. There is not need to go necessarily through an additional installation of coal. There are other experiences in the world, and I think that from this perspective, chances like the COP26 or other chances offered by the association would be very needed in order to share this experience and to best the best recipe for every country.
Thank you. So learning from others and the whole sort of jobs and investment piece. So thank you. In one line, I remember same question. What's the top thing that Indonesia should think about now?
I think the system approach is absolutely critical, because otherwise we will be only looking at renewables in a sort of individual project financing way, but that's rather, if you look at the jobs growth and sustainability trifecta, which we've been pushing in India as the post-pandemic recovery strategy. I think if Indonesia follows something similar as a framework, it would help.
Fantastic. Louise, same question.
I think it's all about the system value. It's not just about cost. Let's think about the value to society, the environment, the economy, and also the energy system.
Okay, fantastic. Great thing to finish on. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you.
So now we're going to move to an interview. I think there's been a big discussion on the different challenges and solutions, and we really did want to spotlight grids and infrastructure and digital, because it's a really, really important part. Can we invite Claudio Fachin, the CEO of Hitachi Energy, on? Great, Claudio, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
You heard quite a lot of the challenges and the potential solutions in helping Indonesia transition. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that I heard from in the conversation. One was the comment on more renewables in our current generation. So Dr. Ghosh said we're going to create more renewables in our installed capacity today. And then Salvatore said the system will not allow the closure of the plant. So those two quotes, I think as emerging markets grow their share of renewable energy, grids become increasingly important, right? So you're looking at huge volumes and systems that are not used to taking those volumes. What are some of the key challenges that emerging markets like India and Indonesia are facing, and what are some of the thoughts on how we can address that.
Sure, Melissa. Well, first of all, I think in the previous panel we heard very much a very balanced overview on everything that basically needs to be addressed, and this system value framework approach really helped us, all our stakeholders, to look at all the different aspects. We were closing the first session with looking at how do we shift jobs, how do we reskill people to make sure that there is a benefit also on ultimately the local content. We also heard very clearly from Luis, and Salvatore mentioned it as well, the topic of course, there is no doubt that in order for us to deliver the challenging and ambitious targets that we have on carbon neutrality, we have to generate energy in a clean fashion, and therefore renewables is the main option. On the other side is as important, and it was really well explained, the topic about energy efficiency, the topic about reducing the consumption or optimizing that consumption. And in between, there has been more and more now awareness created about investments needed to make sure that the energy that is produced in a clean way gets also used in an optimal way, and connecting all this, the grid in between, on backbone transmission, but also at the edge of the grid, making sure that we have technologies that support managing this much larger system and also much more complex. And if you look at then specific countries, Indonesia, India, that were mentioned, they're both representing, I would say, the highest level of complexity of what that system requires. And why is that? Because if you take Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken, it's 17,000 or more than 17,000 islands, but you also have large consumption points. It was mentioned by earlier that generation of that energy is not located where the consumption is. So you need to go through the technology portfolio and look at backbone transmission, large interconnectors that bring the large power supplies into the consumption points. At the same time, you need to enable to have access to clean but also affordable and reliable energy and electricity in these 17,000 islands. And as we know today in Indonesia, most of them, they rely on diesel power generation. So shifting then from the local renewables, whether it's solar, wind, also geothermal, and then making sure that we deliver the technology that allow this electricity to be reliable and affordable. There is one aspect of this really well-detailed plan, I would say, that was delivered recently for Indonesia within this system value framework, that looked at, for instance, technologies such as digital would enable several $100 million of savings by precisely addressing the efficiency, by taking away the wasted energy that Luis was referring, that gets generated and not adequately used because of inefficient management of those systems.
And maybe just to chip in to give some context, I think what Claudio's referring to is the system value analysis. There was a couple of numbers there that was saying that interruptions, the level of interruptions in Indonesia was much, much higher than compared to like a Thailand or a Malaysia. So their SAFI score was a lot higher. And then the second number would have been the percentage losses. So the percentage losses was something like, I think, 9% from memory. And Malaysia and Thailand are 7 and even lower. So it was a few $100 million in trying to reduce the interruptions, because obviously that's lost revenue, as well as the amount of money spent on those losses.
Precisely.
Right.
Now, if I look at India, and we talked about that earlier, there we have deployed technology, in this case for transmitting large bulk resources of energy east to west in India. And that system, which allows for roughly 6,000 megawatt worth of power transmission, that system alone, because of the efficiency, because of the reduced losses, basically avoids the equivalent of one additional coal-fired power plant. Right. So there is a lot of technology out there available today that allow us to address both integration, much faster integration of renewables on one end, much faster usage of electricity as the main source of energy, because Luis described it very well. It's the most efficient way to use energy. And then in between, managing all that complexity with technology that simply 15 years ago was not there. And digital is progressing way faster than we're all used to. And we have to challenge ourselves to innovate faster, to innovate not only in technology, but innovate also on how we collaborate, how we create smarter regulatory environment that we talked about before, so that that technology can get deployed at the speed and at the scale that is required.
Yeah, I think, in fact, we named the solution zero net cost digitalization of the grid. I think one thing to build, you mentioned around policy, because I think there was a grid operations comment, right, from Salvatore around the grid operator won't let me do that. I think you've implemented grids, offshore wind here, and very high levels of penetration. In these markets, we are moving from Indonesia maybe 5% or less to eventually getting to north of 20, where India is now, to where Europe is. Tell us about the regulation and policy that needs to enable the system to be able to work with the digital. So on the technical side, assume that it can be sorted, but there probably has to be changes in how, flexibility and inertia and everything is managed. So what are some of the things that you've seen that you would advise markets?
There is three areas. One is policies and regulations that need to incentivize better deployment, faster deployment of the renewables. So there's regulation that needs to be reviewed, updated, so that the investments that are needed gets the right returns and therefore become attractive. Then on the other side, there is also regulation that needs to support this whole efficiency and the better use of energy and the better use of electricity across sectors. So once again, the overview of the system, we need to be able to look at regulation that goes across sectors. We are used to have regulations for the energy system, for the electricity grid, for industrial sectors, for building and commercial sectors. Today, we have to be able to look at many of those aspects horizontally. Right. Because if we want to take the 50 to 80% share of electricity in the overall energy system, we have to be able to create regulation that allows that system overview. If I do optimization on electricity on buildings, what does that mean for renewable deployment, for grid deployment? If I do the same for transportation, Salvatore mentioned electrical vehicles. That is a tremendous change in terms of how all that electricity system needs to work, and therefore the regulation needs to look at that horizontally. And then there is also something in between. And here in Europe, there has been quite some work, and I have to say that from a European standpoint, and when I talk about Europe, I talk about the energy system in Europe, so that includes also the UK in that, with all the interconnections. There have been regulations that have incentivized interconnection, incentivize a minimum capacity dedicated to share that flow of energy, of electricity across countries. And that allows, of course, to deal with some of the problems that Salvatore was mentioning in terms of balancing the overall system. And I think that that learning can be deployed in other countries, including Indonesia, India, and the emerging markets. The importance of that regulation is also set the priorities right.
So maybe my last question, and it will be in one sentence, and you can only pick one. What would be the one recommendation on the infrastructure or digital side that you would say is the most important thing that India and Indonesia and other markets like that need to do to get to support the coal to renewables transition?
I think the specifically for Indonesia and to some extent India, it's really about finding a way to create the policies and the regulations around that allow financings to flow in, allow to take into account who's going to benefit from the savings that we get by reducing losses in the grid, allowing to take into account not only the capex aspect of those investments, but also what are the efficiencies that we deliver during the life cycle, so the OPEX, so looking at capex and OPEX optimization and balancing. And if I would just pick one thing, I think now that we have a clear plan, and I really like the way it was being deployed, that it breaks down a very complex equation, such as entire energy system in Indonesia, into building blocks that Luis was describing, and tackling one by one, starting from then, based on the digitalization, based on edge electrification, what do we need to do in order to incentivize investments to flow in?
Great, great. And that's a perfect segue into the next session. Can we thank Claudio? Everyone can thank Claudio. The next panel is on financing. So following on from his question, what do we need to do to get the money to flow? Can I invite John Moore back on and the panelists who are going to discuss the financing?
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Claudio. Can I have Fabi back on stage? And I believe we have, two of our panelists virtually. We have Pradeep Tharakan, who's unit head at ADB, Asian Development Bank. Morning, afternoon. And Torben Pedersen, who's the CEO of Pension Denmark. So thank you very much for joining us. And Fabi, thanks for being back on stage. So we've talked a lot about the sort of system change and the vision of the new build-out, and it seems fairly clear, actually. We've talked about value, focusing on value, not costs, so the sort of benefits of building out this new clean system. And we've talked about one or two challenges with permitting and regulation and those kinds of things. But let's just talk a little bit about money, sort of how we actually fund this. And the Asian Development Bank's got an energy transition mechanism. So there are going to need to be new approaches taken, I think. And so, Pradeep, it would be really good to hear about what the ETM is. How does it work? And what will be the real benefits for countries like Indonesia?
Great. Good morning, and thank you, John. Thanks for having me on the panel. And good to see you, Fabi. It's been a long time. Just really briefly, I think if I could echo some of the things we heard earlier today, Southeast Asia is the region we are focusing on for a few minutes. It's a region with very high energy demand growth rates. You've got a high dependency on coal. In some of the countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, it's as much as 50 to 60% of the electricity mix. You've got a problem where energy transition has begun in right earnest. Vietnam is a great example where they went from almost nothing in terms of solar PV generation capacity to 16 gigawatts in a matter of 3 years. But what's happening is that as this transition unfurls, we see legacy coal-fired power plants as a problem. These are plants that are standing in the way of our ability to increase the amount of renewable energy in the grid. Now, the issue here is, as was mentioned earlier in the case of India, these power plants have long-term power purchase contracts. These are legitimate businesses. They have an obligation to produce power, and the government has an obligation to buy this power. So if we were to find ways to take these power plants off the grid, we'll have to think about financial mechanisms. So we need, and ADB is well placed to do this. So ETM, or Energy Transition Mechanism, is essentially a blended finance, scalable, and market-based approach that we are developing in close collaboration with the government of Indonesia and the government of Philippines. We are focusing on Southeast Asia as our pilot because it is tractable. It's of a size where we can actually show some progress. At the same time, it also provides us the opportunity to be able to pilot test this and then take it to other regions of the world where it's quite applicable. So the idea is that we pool together concessional resources and commercial resources from a range of entities. It could be commercial investors, it could be development finance institutions, it could be philanthropic foundations, it could be donor, and also from carbon funds. And this pooled capital will be then used to incentivize the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. There is no one-size-fits-all. We always say that ETM is really an approach. It's akin to a Swiss Army knife, if you will. Depending on the asset owner, depending on the country, depending on the kind of grid, you'll have to come up with different approaches. Just really quickly, one simple approach is the asset transfer model, essentially where ETM could go in and use lower cost of capital to be able to acquire the ownership of a plant, take over the plant as an owner-operator, and then operate it for fewer years than it would have otherwise operated, and then close it or repurpose it. That's the acquisition model. The second is a synthetic model, where we leave the operator and the owner as it is, but then we re-lever the project. We use concessional or lower cost of capital to provide say, junior debt and replace the equity portion of the plant. And then in return for the owner agreeing to shut down the plant earlier than before or repurpose it. And the third is a portfolio model, and that's been tried in other parts of the world as well, where you have large state-owned asset owners like PLN in the case of Indonesia, or it could be private companies that have multiple assets across the country. Now, you could work out a corporate facility with that asset owner to provide them with the capital they need to set up renewable energy projects and grid upgrades in return for a commitment to shut down coal-fired power plants over time. So the focus here is, firstly, any kind of transition has to be phased. I mean, I think it was mentioned earlier that we're not talking about immediate shutdowns because these countries have very large energy demand growth rates, and we're talking about large systems having to transition. Secondly, it has to be scalable. And third, you have to be able to bring in a blended pool of capital to be able to use that to essentially incentivize asset owners to do this.
And can I ask one quick follow-up in terms of stakeholders? Who needs to buy into this mechanism for it to work? Like, who are the people that you need sort of sign-off and approval from?
No, that's a really good question. I think it's a lot of different stakeholders. I mean, at the highest level, I think you need policy commitment because, as I mentioned, a lot of them are state-owned enterprises that have large assets. There are government obligations involved. So we need policy commitment from the governments to be able to not necessarily commit to an immediate shutdown of coal plants, but a phase out of coal plants over time. And ideally, it also then brings with it the requirement to not build new coal-fired power plants. I mean, you can't have a situation where we bring to bear blended finance and concessional resources to shut down a certain number of plants while others are being built. So that's something so policy commitment is important. The second is any transition is ultimately about people. It's people that enable it. So system operators, the energy ministries, people that work in the sector need to be able to bring on board the commitment and the will to be able to change. We also have to bring on board asset owners. I mean, we see that increasingly a lot of asset owners in the region would like to get out of coal. They see the writing on the wall. Even if there isn't a specific stranding pressure on these assets in the medium term, they know it's only a question of time. Countries in the region are beginning to talk about carbon pricing. There could be carbon taxes in play. You also have issues around global tariffs, such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So definitely asset owners are looking for, reasonable exits. And finally, communities. And I think the general population that will be affected through a transition. So all of these stakeholders will have to be on board.
Okay, that sounds like a lot of work to do that explanation and alignment. But you mentioned asset owners, so I just wanted to bring Torben in terms of Pension Denmark. You have investments with Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, who have raised $1 billion for their new markets fund. You could just say a little bit about that fund, and also if it relates, in some way to this new ETM, and what your thoughts are about how attractive, how your interest in those kinds of schemes, let's say.
Well, thank you, and for this opportunity to share our experiences in this area with you and the audience. Yes, that is right. Back in 2012, Pension Denmark, a Danish pension fund, established a, let's say, specialized investment vehicle called Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners with a group of, let's say, experienced investors from the renewable energy industry on board. In the beginning, we were the only investor, but now we have more than 100 investors in the club, so to say. And our target is by the end of this decade to have something like 100 billion euro under management. So it has actually developed into becoming the world's largest specialized investment fund in renewable energy infrastructure assets. In the beginning, we were active in our, let's say, our own hood in Northwestern Europe. Then we moved to North America. But during the last couple of years, we have found ways to, let's say, use our both industrial and financial experience and capacity to also be an active investor in emerging markets areas, including Southeast Asia. And it's right, as you said in the introduction, we have established a specialized fund called the Emerging Market Fund, which now is active in India, in Vietnam, and also in areas in South America. And we have a strong focus on offshore wind, which is, let's say, some kind of specialty for Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners and also for us as the anchor investor in the structure. And we're now quite long in the planning of the development and the construction of what will become Vietnam's first offshore wind park in the southern part of the country. And recently, we made, actually back in August this year, we made a large investment in AMP Energy India to assist in development of 1.7 gigawatt of renewable projects, a multiple project program. But next to making investments into offshore wind, which provide, let's say, green power to the grid as a substitute for power produced by fossil sources, we actually now have, as you said in the introduction, have moved also into what we would call the second generation of the use of green power, both from solar and from wind, which is using the green power not as only a power into the grids, but also as a natural resource, as the input factor into the production of green hydrogen, which is the basic element in the production of green fuels to the heavy part of the transport industry, heavy trucks, shipping, and airplanes, which are some of the, let's say, high abate industries in the area. And by using green power to produce green hydrogen and green fuels, that could be methanol, we can actually give a very strong contribution to the green transition of these industries. We have a strong dialogue with the large shipping company AP Møller Mærsk on developing what we call it a green line of power to X facilities from Europe along Africa into Asia, which can be used as bunking stations for the shipping industry, providing them with green fuel produced locally by use of either wind or solar or a combination of both. And actually, power to X, as using of green power to produce green hydrogen, can also be used to produce green ammonia, which can be used as green fertilizer in farming, in the agricultural industry. So we can also use now green power in a multiple number of ways compared to, let's say, the first generation, where it was only used as power to the grid. And we are planning a P2X facility in Oman, in in the Middle East and in Australia, and looking into in Chile, and we're also looking into opportunities other places in Southeast Asia. So I think that we should, let's say, broaden our mindset when we are thinking about the use of renewable energy. Of course, still the primary use is as green power into the grid and as a substitute to coal-fired power plants, but also during the coming, let's say, decade as a main natural resource in the production of other types of green fuels and green fertilizer. So. Everybody knows that.
I'm just going to ask Fabi actually, because no problem. It's difficult doing this virtually, and so you're sort of investing in sort of the renewables piece, but also the upcoming sort of hydrogen, the green gas piece of it. Let me just ask Fabi in terms of what do you really want to see from international investors? What does good look like from your perspective?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, as our journey toward net zero emissions, that we have to increase renewable energy capacity, energy efficiency, as I also mentioned earlier. And I think also part of that, we have to reduce coal capacity in the system to allow more renewables to be integrated into the energy system. So we require investment. But also looking at the political economic context in Indonesia, and given that we are not a rich country, we are emerging economy, we still have around 10 to 12% people are really poor, and I think around 40% that the income still pretty low compared to Western standard. So energy cost is very, very sensitive. So that's why in Indonesia context, when we would like to invest in infrastructures, the important question is always that what would that be the cost to the energy as a result of all of these measures, right? Increase renewable, retire coal earlier. So it's politically sensitive. So in Indonesia context, then what is required when it comes to the investment is not just simply having money, right? But what we need is actually low-cost finance. And it's very important to make electricity affordable for everybody. And that, if we can, that's what also what we require from the investor, because many investors see in Indonesia as a risky country with unstable policies, regulations, with the very strong role of state-owned enterprises. All the renewable energy projects depends on state-owned enterprise, our utility, PLN, right? So some investors see that Indonesia is risky, and see this a risky investment, they require higher financing costs, and that actually doesn't match with what is required.
Great, that's a great point actually in terms of investment risk. So Pradeep, in terms of the ETM, how does the ETM address that sort of risk assessment?
Yeah, no, I think this is where the role of ADB is really key. As a multilateral development bank that's owned by 68 member countries, including 49 from the region, and all of developing Asia countries are members of the ADB, we bring in that trust element. And trust is something that's in short supply these days. But luckily we have a reasonable amount of that. Not everybody has the same amount of trust in us, but I think we can definitely say that being the sort of honest broker and setting up ETM or taking the lead on ETM helps us to bring together public and private partners alongside with concessional resources such as from the global climate funds, from philanthropic foundations, and also from global carbon funds. So all of this together is going to help us to reduce the cost of capital, as Fabi was saying. And then by actually bringing together policy commitments at the highest level, and also ensuring that all of the stakeholders, the governments, the investors, follow through on their obligations, and communities are taken care of. And then the just transition elements of this overall energy transition is focused on, we improve the overall risk profile of the project. or the projects per se. So all in all, this then helps to really bring together lower cost of capital. I mean, just a really quick point about institutional money. I mean, there was a recent report by the International Renewable Energy Agency last year. They surveyed about asset managers that manage $80 trillion of funding, and they found that only 5% of that portfolio goes to renewable energy, and you can be certain that even a smaller percentage of that goes to Southeast Asia. So the key is, and large institutional investors don't like project risk, and as Fabi was saying, they look at country risks. So creating a platform and creating a portfolio approach with reputable and trusted entities coming together with the right contractual framework will hopefully allow for investment at scale by these institutional investors who are a good source of low-cost money eventually.
Fantastic.
Well, I fully agree with you, Pradeep. And I think that the development of blended finance models is one of the main paths going forward, where we combine money from the development banks, from the national aid agencies, and money from our sector. We have a number of funds together with the Danish government, where the Danish government accept a first loss position in order to reduce the risk, both the real and the perceived risk from institutional investors. And I think that by working together, we can actually generate a lot of leverage in the flow of funding into this area. And I think you should be very optimistic. I agree with you that at the moment, a too small amount of institutional money is invested in renewable energy, but it is on the rise. And I think if we have this meeting in 3-4 years' time, this percentage could easily be doubled from present level. Yeah.
Can I ask one quick question, Torben, about green bonds? Interesting, big opportunity or not? I mean, there's sort of 750 billion issued last year and more than that already in the first half of this year. What do you think about green bonds?
Well, green bond is a very important part of the total funding structure for the green transition. We are focusing on, let's say, equity-like investments, because that we have access to a development and construction premium, which makes the risk-return situation more attractive from us. But a lot of institutional investors, especially those with let's say, very tight liability structures, are very interested in demand for green bonds. So I think that there's room for both increasing the green bond market, but also to find ways to attract say, more risk capital with a higher risk appetite in the equity or mezzanine area. That's where we are most active.
Okay, fantastic. And we're a bit short on time. I'm going to leave the last word to Fabi. You've heard from development side, you've heard from a big asset owner. Are you encouraged by what you hear in terms of getting inward investment into Indonesia?
Well, I think, yes, I see that ETM mechanism, if structured right, I think it could resolve a number of issues, and also the part of the recommendations that we made in our study, Scaling Up Solar, that published a couple of months ago, together ISR and BNEF report. One of the recommendations is to address the offer supply issue in Indonesia, offer capacities in Indonesia power system, right? So, I mean, by reducing coal capacities that wasted actually, and that create financial burden of PLN, replace that with renewable energy capacity is actually a good way in terms of increasing renewable energy penetration and reducing the emissions. So what is need to work is that we have to make sure that this system work. I mean, as the approach like Pradeep mentions, like create a platform and put a portfolio approach is very interesting to see. And also, I understand that our government, Indonesian government, already signing on this initiative, and even to commit to provide more resources. I think it's a good start. Well, we have to see how how this work in the near future.
Yeah, fantastic. And as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stakeholders need to buy in, but the more people thinking about that and understanding the vision, the better. So Pradeep, Torben, and Fabi, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
So I think that comes to the end. Yeah, I think that comes to the end of our session. I think we heard about the context and the vision, the commitment and the plan that's there, the need for financing and the innovative portfolio approach that's coming with the energy transition mechanism, the institutional money that is hopefully going to also follow and that's growing. So with that, I think I want to just show you the link to the system value report that we've been referring to all afternoon. Also encourage you to look at the solar report that was also referred to as well, and about the energy transition mechanism that was just launched. So with that, thanks for joining us on Coal to Renewables. More to come in this space.